We knew that we could potentially be pretty well known as the New Hampshire IPA. We kind of had relatively high confidence that we could hopefully achieve something like that. That was the sales pitch to the investors. We didn't really know for sure that what was going to happen, but we thought we got a good beer, got a good brand, we think. Maybe this will work, right?
Welcome to Seacoast Stories, a podcast about the people, businesses, and newsmakers that make the Seacoast an American hidden gem. I'm Trey Farkas, and on today's episode, how Stoneface Brewing helped get craft beer to the Seacoast and why their signature IPA has made early investors very happy. Here's something I'm very proud of. After college, I moved to Connecticut to work at ESPN. But there's not much to do in central Connecticut, so I quickly learned that I had to pick up some hobbies. And for whatever reason, I decided craft beer could be something I'd like. So I started going to some breweries, and I quickly found a passion for exploring new places, trying different beers, and enjoying these beers over conversations with random people. Eventually, a friend gave me a map with every single brewery in Connecticut, and at the time, there were 85, and so I decided I would go to every single one as a way to A, explore the state, and B, drink different beers. Unfortunately, I failed to achieve my goal because, well, COVID. But I did manage to make it to 65 amazing breweries, and I am very proud of that. But when I moved to New Hampshire, I didn't set such a goal because my liver can't take it anymore, but the love for craft beer remains. One beer I love is the Stoneface IPA. It's been around for 10 years, and it arrived on the scene just before craft beer took off in New Hampshire. Back in 2014, Smutty Nose and Throwback were really the only game in town, but Google tells me there's over 90 breweries in the state now, and one of the most popular is Stoneface Brewing. Luckily for me, today's guest, co-founder Pete Beauregard, invited me to Stoneface to talk about how they got their start 10 years ago, among many other topics. As for his start, Pete grew up in the North Country in Littleton, New Hampshire. The son of the school guidance counselor and also a teacher, Pete told me he never drank in high school because he couldn't get away with it, but I still don't quite believe him. According to Pete, he didn't have his first drink until he attended UNH, and this is what he had.
It wasn't even a beer. It was an Australian citrus fizzy something or other. I think it was called Two Dogs. And it was the most palatable option at the time, I guess, when I was coming up. And then, we started to get into things like J.W. Dundee's Honey Brown, if you remember that, or Sam Adams Summer Ale had just come out that year. So those were a couple of gateway beers for us.
So when did you start brewing your own beer?
The story is interesting. I had a job in Portsmouth. So next to Prescott Park, there's a bunch of new condos that are like right on that little U-turn at the bottom of the hill. And that used to be like the biggest restaurant in Portsmouth. It was called Pier 2 at the time. And the summer before I think it was before my junior year in college at UNH, I was working at that restaurant waiting tables. It was the first table waiting job I had. There happened to be a homebrew shop downtown Portsmouth across the street from the Portsmouth Brewery. I had like $100 in my pocket and I'd been interested in beer. And so I said, well, I'm going to swing in there and check this place out. I was curious. And I walk in there and the guy behind the counter, he set me up with a couple of buckets, bottle capper and a homebrew kit. And I brought it home and I was living at Young Drive, which is at the time was a little bit of a party street in Durham. I don't think they're allowing that anymore, but we had a house with a basement. And so I made this batch of beer, put it in the basement, it fermented, and we bottled it up, me and my roommates. At the time, it was the summertime, so there wasn't a lot of people around to share it with, right? So that you have a whole bunch of beer now, and you probably ought to do something with it. So I brought a 6-pack into the restaurant one night at Pier 2 after we closed, and I had stuck it in the walk-in, brought it out, and there was this guy that was working the grill that didn't like me very much at the time. It was my first waiting job, so I'd put stuff in the computer and screw things up, and he'd get pissed. And so I'm going to make friends with this guy, So we finish mopping the floor in the kitchen and I get these beers out and I crack one, I hand it to him and he's like, wow, this is really good, And he was my buddy at that point, you know what I mean? And just give him one beer that I made, I told him all about the process and he's like, wow, this is really good. And that kind of sparked something to me that's, being able to give somebody something and they enjoy it. And it's like, that's a really great instant feedback kind of thing. It makes you feel good. And so we continued to make beer and it all sucked after that, and I didn't dare bring him anymore. And so senior year of college, I didn't really do much brewing. Ended up getting a job at a software company in downtown Portsmouth doing sales, selling software. So calling people up, explaining what it did, and hopefully they buy it. And, we finally got a little bit of more money because it was a real full-time job. And so we started to build out the homebrew system at home. And at the time I was working at this company, I had a friend there that introduced me to a brewer from Smutty Nose. His name's Charlie Ireland. He's still around the Seacoast, still making beer. He's a really talented brewer. And we got to be friends. And, he introduced me to some other guys and continued to build that homebrew kit out and make more and more beer and it's just practice, right? It's kind of like cooking, right? If you do it a lot, you learn the ingredients, you kind of know what goes together, what doesn't, trial and error a little bit. So, that's kind of like early on, that's sort of where the spark happened.
So at what point in your home brewing experimentation did you start to think, wait, I might be onto something here?
Well, it wasn't really ever like that. It was more kind of boredom with the software industry or I suppose just being a little bit disenfranchised with, the rat race. And the guy, Charlie at Smutty Nose, he introduced me to Dave Yarrington, who was actually the executive brewer at Smutty Nose at the time. And we had become friends because I just introduced myself at the Barley Pub in Dover one night. We were hanging out and got shooting the breeze with him, and eventually sharing beers with him. He's like, you guys are doing all the right things. You're focused on all the right things. This is something that you could potentially build into a business. And it really didn't cross our minds because it didn't seem like it was something that you could do. I mean, it didn't really dawn on us that this could be a business or a career,
Right. And just for context, what year is this?
This is like, probably around 2010, 12, somewhere in there.
Right. So the craft brewing boon has not taken off yet.
Yeah. It kind of had the big wave in the late 90s. And then a lot of that petered out. And then sort of the proliferation of all these breweries that we have today, it started happening probably 3 or 4 years after we started. So yeah, I mean, the idea, for us was, well, we should try to start a business. And, there's breweries like Throwback who had just started in a small way, and it seemed like, okay, they're making great beers and we could potentially do something similar, but there wasn't really a good model for something that's sort of mid-sized, right? So we didn't have a good sense as to how we should start until we started to do the math. So the math, we knew we wanted it to be a business. We knew we wanted it to put food on our tables. We knew we weren't going to get rich, but we sort of thought this could be super duper interesting if we can at least get a scale that pays the bills, right? And we can hire some good people to help out. And we never expected it to blow up or be anything, monstrous. We just thought we can make a living and it'll be fun, it'll be better than the rat race and trying to catch bad guys in security software.
So originally you founded Stoneface alongside 3 other people.
Yep.
How did you assemble that team?
So my friend Errol and Tim and my other friend Tim, we were sitting around Tim's kitchen table one night and we started talking about it. And he's like, I bet you we could raise some money. I bet you we could find some people to raise some money to do this. Cause we didn't, the 3 of us, we had careers, but we were just starting families. I had young kids. We all 3 of us had young kids. And we knew based on our business plan that we needed to start at a scale that was a little bigger than like 3-barrel system. We needed something that was at least 15, which, gives you a little bit of economy of scale. Nothing like, a big brewer like Smutty Nose or Anheuser-Busch or even Treehouse, for example, all these guys. But we knew we needed to start with a little bit of scale. So Tim and Errol are like, well, we got a business plan. We can probably come up with a brand. We didn't have a brand yet. And so, that started the wheels really accelerating. Ultimately, we had a kernel of a business plan that got built out over the next few months. And then we ended up coming up with the Stoneface name, it was actually a neighbor of mine up the street who said, you guys got to just use Stoneface. And I had stumbled across Stoneface at one point, like trying to do research, seeing the great Stoneface, which is the Old Man of the Mountain, right? So the Old Man of the Mountain, which fell, I think it's got to be way before we started. I think it was 2011 maybe that the rock face came down. I have to look it up. But
I had no idea.
Yeah, so you're not familiar with the Old Man?
No.
Okay, so up in the North Country, so Cannon Mountain, which is in Franconia Notch, there was a rock outcropping that if you look at it from specific places in the notch, you look right up on the side of the mountain, there's a clear as day profile of a man's face. And in the hop logo, you can see there's the nose, the mouth, and the chin, and the forehead. So the idea is that's sort of our tip of the cap to the Old Man of the Mountain, and it's a pretty iconic landmark and symbol of the state of New Hampshire. So if you look at the road signs, there's little weird profiles on the road signs on some of the routes and stuff, and the state quarter has that on it. So the Great Stoneface was a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne that. He talks about people that might see that for the first time and be in awe of it. So the Great Stoneface is what we decided to name the brewery, which is a whole other story because I felt uncomfortable naming it that. And I think that's why I originally glossed over the name originally, because Stone Brewing Company in California was pretty popular at the time. We were nervous that we'd get like a cease and desist letter if we started with it. So we used email and some contacts. We tried to get emails to the CEO of Stone, and he eventually said, cool, just make it all one word, don't separate it. And that was another sort of turning point for the company. We said, all right, we got a name, we got a brand, we got a logo. All right, let's see if we can, send the business plan around and raise some money.
How much funding did you get, and how did you go about getting it?
So we got a few $100,000. It was enough to
just a few $100,000.
I mean, we needed it, because we needed to buy big equipment, right? So the three of us had a little bit of money to kick in. And then we went out to friends and family with a business plan. And we had some friends. I had a friend from the software industry who was a bit of a mentor of mine. And he had made a little bit of money in software, and he was able to kick in a big chunk of that. Some other friends, helped us out. Obviously, they have equity in the company still. And hopefully they, at some point, maybe they do well and this works out for them. But it was enough money for us to buy the level of equipment that we needed so that we knew we could make money. And dumb luck, we had 5 years of a business plan laid out. That's it. That was all we had at the original time. We had 5 years. And we hit our numbers in crazy different ways, right? The business plan said one thing and the numbers said another thing, but the volume goals and the revenue goals all were met within 10% for those first 5 years. So, I don't know if it was the fact that we wrote it down, we were able to hit goals, or if it just happened to line up that way. But, we knew that if we could hit those goals over time, that the company could sustain itself.
What was the original vision that you were selling your investors on? Because obviously you have to give some of your story and what you envision this thing to be before they commit their life savings to you.
Yeah. Hopefully it wasn't their life savings. It was, a lot of it had to do with beer quality and the fact that there was some green space available, right? So we knew that we could potentially be pretty well known as the New Hampshire IPA. We kind of had relatively high confidence that we could hopefully achieve something like that. That was the sales pitch to the investors. We didn't really know for sure that was what was going to happen, but we thought we got a good beer, got a good brand. We think, maybe this will work, right? And it was more along the lines of imagery and the fact that we had an Easter egg in our logo that's the Old Man of the Mountain. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot of fluff. It was mostly you're pitching to business people in a lot of ways, and we're saying, put your money here because we can probably return more later at some point in the future instead of putting it in a traditional investment or whatever. So I think that probably, for the most part, people that we went to understood. If people came to us and said, well, when am I going to get my money back? I'll give you this if you give me this. We kind of said, well, you got to understand this is a startup. We don't know. There's no guarantees here. So we generally didn't take folks on that kind of didn't understand that, this is something that's going to be a future potential or, help us grow it, dividends may come out of it, whatever, so.
Now, how did you happen upon this location? We are just off exit 4, not necessarily the place you think a thriving business would be placed.
Well, we had looked at some places in Dover. And then, some of those things just weren't going to work. we thought we had a line on a good location in the middle of Dover that, it just wasn't going to work well for what we needed to do. And I just happened to be driving by this building one day and saw a sign up. It was for rent. So, we call the landlord, my partner, Errol, he comes in and he says, I think we should sign this lease. He talked to the landlord, and actually the room we're sitting in now was not the original space. It was down a few units this way. We still have the brewery in that location. We said we're going to have a little tiny tasting room, and we're here to manufacture beer. We're not here for a restaurant experience. And so that's ultimately completely serendipitous. We happened to drive by. It was available. It fit our budget. It's not the prettiest building in the world, and it's not the best location, but so far it's worked. And this space came up for lease in 2017. And we never really wanted to have a restaurant, but at the time, the laws in the state of New Hampshire said if you want to serve a pint to customers, you're going to have to serve food. So I said, well, if we're going to be required to serve food, it's going to have to be at a level that I want to eat here and I want to be proud of it. And so I love to cook. I love flavors. I love food. And so we said, we got to make sure that we do it right. So when this came up for lease, we built it out, moved the canning line over here, and this is what you see today.
Wow. Okay. That sounds like a ridiculous law. I'll ask you more about that. But once, and you guys officially launched in 2014, 10 years ago. So once you had the location, the name, the logo, the branding, the 5-year plan, once you had all of that laid out and officially opened your doors, what were the early days like in terms of the operating behind the scenes and just how the public was receiving it?
A little bit of chaos. I had never brewed professionally before, but I've always been interested in mechanical stuff and, process stuff, plumbing, electrical, stuff like that. So I had a good sense as to what it was going to look like when we built the system. And I was the one here with the person that they send a guy to help install the brewery when it shows up. And he walked me through everything, and I was able to understand most of it. But the first brew was not correct. I was here by myself trying to figure out how to do things. And then there was other things like cleaning tanks was a mystery in a lot of ways because they're big, they're CIP tanks. So, I'm calling friends that professional brewers, and I'm like, can you just please come here so I don't kill myself trying to figure this out, And a few practice runs, you get more comfortable with it. It's just a little more dangerous than brewing at home. The stuff is hotter, the chemicals are more harsh, there's higher pressures. So you got to be cognizant of all that stuff. So we had the brewery running, and we were kegging beers and selling them to the distributor to place for us because we didn't have a sales team, and I wasn't able to drive kegs around. I mean, it was too big a scale for one person to do it. Just batch by batch, you've got 30 kegs of beer you got to find a place for. So we used a distributor to do that. I happened to go to UNH with one of the guys that we use in distribution. That was another sort of serendipitous thing. Having a relationship with somebody in the beer industry from a distribution perspective helped us quite a bit. And then we started to build out the tasting room, which was literally just a box that we built of walls inside of the warehouse where people could come in and ultimately get free samples because at the time the laws were weird and they've changed since then. But at the time we were able to give people like a little taster glass and they could buy growlers. And at the time we didn't have bottles, so we just had growler fills. But people started to come, and it was at the time, I think it was early on enough where there was enough interest in new craft breweries where people were curious to check places out. We hopefully gave them a good experience. So they, kind of knew about us and would buy the beer out and ask for it at bars and restaurants and things like that. So, but it was me, Errol working on the weekends, serving beers in the tasting room. And then eventually we said, we need help. We were very, very fortunate to have great people helping us out, working in the tasting room, helping us brew. My father-in-law, my dad would come and help bottle once we get our bottling line set up. It was pretty chaotic because we didn't know day to day what we were going to face. If the tap room's busy, okay, we got to step away from the canning line or bottling line. If it's not busy, we might have to find a floor to sweep, So it was an interesting time.
Coming up, the sole reason why Stoneface took off and why they finally decided to make a hard seltzer. Stay with us. This is Seacoast Stories. Hey everyone, it's Troy. I want to tell you a quick story, and then we'll get right back to this episode. Last week, I grabbed a drink with a new friend, and he told me about New Hampshire and how it gets a bad rap around the country, and that people really only know it as a place that's somewhere in the Northeast and that is important once every 4 years. But otherwise, no one thinks much of it. And then he told me how much he loves this podcast and why it's so cool that a, quote, world-class podcaster, his words, not mine, is finding and telling the stories of the people who deserve to have their stories told. And honestly, I'm loving finding the people, having the conversations, making the show, and most importantly, telling the stories. But producing and growing a podcast is a lot of work. And I just need one favor from you to help me make it bigger and better each week. If you could press the follow button wherever you're listening to this show, it would help more than you could ever know. So thank you so much for doing that and for being here. I really appreciate it. Now back to today's story. So the Stoneface IPA is the flagship beer, one of the OG beers. When you guys were first brewing that, serving it in the tap room, distributing it, did you have any sense or any idea of just how popular it would become?
No, not at all. I mean, we liked that beer a lot. You know, we drank it quite a bit, and people would tell us, this is good, I like it. But we never had any sort of expectation around whether or not it would become popular. We knew that if we could sustain the business, that's all we cared about. Can we sustain it, put food on the table? It's fantastic. If it grows, it grows, but there's limited control over how much you can influence that. I mean, you can influence quite a bit, but you can't necessarily steer people's tastes if you don't have massive marketing budgets and huge sales efforts and stuff like that. So, you know, again, we were pretty lucky that it caught on. But I think that when we were first homebrewing that beer, the goal that we had with that beer was, let's find something that's a little sweeter than what's on the market, a little less bitter, but still has quite a bit of hoppy character to it, that is, you know, citrusy and aromatic, you know, has a good alcohol punch. And there wasn't really much like that on the market. You know, there was like beers that were like Heady Topper in Vermont, some beers from California that were a little bit heavily hopped, that were a little sweeter, like Lagunitas IPA is a sweeter beer. But there weren't a lot of New England style IPAs. Treehouse had just started, Bissell Brothers had just started, Trillium had just started. So there weren't quintessential examples of New England IPA other than things like Heady Topper, for example, which is kind of like an OG New England style IPA or Vermont style IPA. So we kind of said, well, we want something that's in between all these things, like something that's nice and refreshingly hoppy, but not too bitter and a little sweeter, that would appeal to palates that don't like the bitterness of IPA, which was, you know, the market at the time. There was this arms race for bitterness back in the early 2000s that if people loved them, they loved them, but if they hated them, they really hated them. So we tried to find something that would appeal to my mom and my dad, you know what I mean? Or, you know, people that didn't necessarily drink IPA at all would take a chance on this and say, wow, this is something that I can get behind.
You told me that the Stoneface IPA account for 75 to 85% of your production. And so I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this. You've got the hit single, but you also have an entire album. Are you more proud of just how big the Stoneface IPA has become, or are you a bit frustrated that the other beers are nowhere near as popular as the IPA is?
I don't know if frustration would be the right word. The big reason we got into brewing is to share this stuff with people that might not know much about it. So when we brew something that we think is, you know, that can stand next to IPA, or might be even from our perspective, something that we enjoy a little bit more, maybe. It's kind of like picking your favorite child, I suppose, but it's a bit of a head scratcher when things that we make aren't getting as much attention or aren't as popular. It's just kind of surprising. Like, I think Full Clip is a beer we make that can stand right next to Stoneface IPA, and it's fantastic. It's a different beer altogether, but it's really good. But the other thing is that there's so many things that you can do in beer. I mean, you can make beer taste like all kinds of different flavors, right? There's a massive variety of flavor that you can coax out of these ingredients. You can have beer that tastes like wine like champagne, you're going to have sour beers, you're going to have dark, rich, chocolatey beers, you're going to have hoppy, all these things. And for whatever reason, people like 7.2% alcohol IPAs, So it's something that's easily accessible, I suppose, and something that people gravitate towards. But it would be great if some of the other beers were a little more popular. Obviously we have limited capacity here. So if something did become more popular, then something would have to give, right? We'd have to make less IPA or whatever. But to have the luxury to be able to experiment and try new things and still have that one beer that does really well in the market, we're very lucky, and it's a luxury to be able to do that.
Well, a recent experiment of Stoneface's that has been greenlit is the Seacoast Seltzer, which you guys released a few months ago. Now, Pete, you're a little bit late to the seltzer game. The seltzers have really proliferated over the past few years, kind of spearheaded by White Claw and then all sorts of imitators. You know how this goes. So with that being said, why was now the time to release the Seacoast Seltzer?
The timing is just because we figured out how to do it. It took us a while to figure it out. It wasn't necessarily a high priority, but we have been experimenting with a clear seltzer base for quite some time. And we knew we wanted to make it from scratch with sugar and water and yeast. We also had folks in the tasting room that don't necessarily like beer. I had some friends that would give me a hard time because they'd be like, hey, you don't have liquor, you don't have cider, what's the story? I can't bring so-and-so here. So we said, let's give it a shot. And it took a long time to sort of convince everybody that works here that this was a good idea, because we're all beer purists. At the end of the day, we're all really passionate about beer, but we also are interested in flavor, and we're interested in discovering new things. And the other seltzer brands, they are what they are, and they some are great, some are not as great. We don't think that ours is something that's 10 times better than anything that's on the market right now, but there are some things about it that we think are unique. And a lot of times there's a drinking occasion that doesn't necessarily bode well for a beer, right? Maybe it's, you're on a boat, you're on the beach. Would you prefer an imperial stout in those situations, or would you prefer something that's crisp and refreshing and, not necessarily a beer? There's a lot of folks that are concerned about gluten and sugar and higher density, higher calorie beverages. This can sort of fill that void. And a lot of folks here, we find ourselves, we'll have a beer in the afternoon, and then maybe that's followed up by a seltzer, and then, it's quitting time or whatever. So it's tended to be something that fills in drinking occasions and is additive, not an alternative. It's something that's, it makes the occasion better, and something that's better suited for something that's a little different is important to a lot of the folks here.
Now, without losing me too much in the brewing process, how different is the beer making process versus the seltzer making process? And did you guys have to completely overhaul your operations here, or was it a seamless transition?
It's pretty seamless because the equipment is mostly the same. The difference between beer and seltzer base is really just the way that the source of the fermentables in it. So for beer, the way that you get sugar to ferment for beer is from a barley mash, which basically is grains. They get steeped in hot water and then they get strained. And that sweet liquid is what we boil and then ferment with yeast. And the yeast take the sugar and convert it into alcohol and carbon dioxide and other flavor components. So you have grain that you strain, basically, boil and ferment. With seltzer, you skip the grains because we get sugar. So it could be just sugarcane, dextrose, really any kind of sugar that's fermentable. It doesn't necessarily matter. So imagine just table sugar in water. So we dissolve table sugar in water and we boil that and then chill it and put yeast in. And there isn't a lot of nutrition in that liquid. So the yeast aren't very happy. So we add some nutrients, so vitamins, minerals, things like that, into that sugar solution, and then the yeast can go to work on it. And then what you're finished with is sort of a cloudy, white wine-ish, cidery sort of flavor in that fermented liquid. And so we carbon filter it just through like a regular old, activated charcoal filter. And we run it into our bright tanks and then add natural flavors. So we buy natural flavors and we do combinations. So that's been the fun part about seltzer, is that it's sort of instant gratification, whereas beer, it takes a couple of weeks for it to ferment, and then out the other side comes the result. With seltzer, you have a clean base that's just basically carbonated alcoholic water, and we can add flavors to it. We can use a little pipette and dose different kinds of flavors, different manufacturers, and you can instantly know, okay, this is the flavor profile I want. So very similar to like adding a little salt in when you're cooking, or this needs a little tarragon, or this needs a little thyme, or whatever. That's how it's been exciting for us to come up with flavor combos.
So you and I are speaking at the brewery on July 15th. Let's say you're brewing today the IPA and the seltzer, full clip, half clip, and today's the day one of the brewing process. How long until these respective beverages are available in the tap room?
So it's typically between 2 and 3 weeks from the day we brew it.
Oh, that's faster than I thought.
Yeah. So those kinds of beers, they're quick, mostly because they're all ales, right? So a lager is something that lagers, which is basically means that it's cold stored for a long period of time. The lagers can take between a month or 2 months, depending on what we're making. And a lot of times it has to do with how the flavors sort of meld over time. So we'll taste lagers over a period of weeks. And then once they hit the point where, wow, this is really starting to shine, then we'll package it and go from there. But most of the beers that we make are ales, and they take anywhere between 2 and 3 weeks.
Okay. Can we run through some quick definitions? Just give me like the quick 1 or 2 sentences. What is a lager?
So lager basically is a beer that uses lager yeast instead of an ale yeast, right? So an ale yeast ferments at warmer temperatures, typically between 65 and 72 degrees-ish. And a lager would ferment in the 50s. So it's a slower fermenting yeast that is a little bit cleaner, less fruity. What you typically see used throughout the world for most beer is a lager yeast. So Budweiser, Amstel, all those things, they're lagers. And that just basically means that they're fermented at a lower temperature with a different type of yeast.
Okay. So is an ale higher temperature,
Exactly
different kind
right.
of yeast?
Yep, exactly
Okay.
right. Yep.
What's a pale ale?
So same idea. It's just a pale ale would be something that, for us, our definition of pale ale, I suppose this is aggressively changed over the years. But for example, if you've ever had a Bass Pale Ale, that's a British style of a pale ale. If you have a Stoneface Pale Ale that we might make, it's probably a lot hoppier than a Bass Pale Ale. And it's probably slightly more alcoholic, but there's definitions of what these things are supposed to be in the beer judge certification program guidelines. Off the top of my head, I'm not a Cicerone or anything like that, so I don't know off the top of my head all the specific style guidelines. But a pale ale is going to be a little less alcoholic and less hoppy than, let's say, an IPA, which would have more alcohol and more hops, versus like a lager, which might have very little hops and much lower alcohol compared to a pale ale and an IPA.
Okay. So you've just told us what an IPA is. What is the difference between a New England style IPA and a West Coast IPA?
I would say that the biggest difference is there's probably 2 big differences that most people would recognize. One is the level of bitterness. So the West Coast IPA is going to be significantly more bitter than New England IPA. And the other thing is the appearance. So traditionally a West Coast IPA that you'd see would be pretty clear, versus a New England IPA, which would probably have a lot of cloudiness and a lot more hops and suspension, for example.
The big difference in my head is that the New England style IPA is just much better.
Yeah, it's a lot sweeter, less hot, less bitter. So yeah, it appeals to a broader spectrum of folks that drink beer.
Let's circle back to something you said earlier. So you opened in 2014, originally just a tasting room. So you were just serving little tasters. You were not giving people pints.
Right, correct.
It was tasters in the tap room, and then they could take growlers and cans to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So New Hampshire said, if you want to serve a pint, you have to serve food with it. Why was that the law?
Well, originally I think that they believe that if you have food available, people will eat and the alcohol won't get absorbed in their bloodstream as fast and there won't be as many people drinking and driving, for example. I don't know. This is craft beer. I don't think that most people overindulge heavily in these kinds of beverages, or people that are interested in these kinds of beverages aren't necessarily overindulging as much as, if you had a bar with shots and out liquor and stuff like that, there's a little bit more risk there, I think. But, at the time, that's what the law was. So we said, well, let's do the restaurant. Since then, I think the laws have changed a little bit where you could potentially have a food truck or you could have, a pizza delivered or whatever. I'm not entirely sure about the laws at this point, mostly because I don't care anymore because we've got a restaurant anyway. It was one of those things where I guess we're going to have to do this. Let's start a restaurant. And it's been fun because I never expected to have a restaurant. But like I said earlier, I like food. I like to cook. It's been fun to have a commercial kitchen to be able to do cool things. I'm in there quite a bit, experimenting, helping out and stuff. So it's a bit of a blessing and it's got its difficulties because it's a restaurant still. And I respect anybody that's in the restaurant industry. And we have a lot of friends that are in the restaurant industry and, it's a difficult business, but when you can make it work, you're kind of delivering magic to people in a lot of ways. People go out to eat for special occasions. They, want to have a birthday out or they want to have an anniversary. And we always need to remember that because delivering an experience is important, especially when somebody's trying to have an experience, right? Especially when it's a special occasion. So it's been fun to share those things with folks and then walk around the tasting room and pour samples and see people enjoy things that we make here. And it's pretty inspiring.
Well, your dedication to quality in the kitchen is very clear. I had a friend recently hyping up the smash burger that you guys have here, telling me it was the best in New England. So you can hang your hat on that.
It's always good. It never gets old hearing that stuff. That's for sure.
So Stoneface is a beloved brand in the area. You and your buddies have been at it for 10 years now. People speak very glowingly of Stoneface, of not only the products, but the space, the experience that you guys serve here. What do you attribute that to? What do you attribute people's love for this place to?
It's another good question. A lot of times people ask why we originally got into this. And, it's typically like, how did you get into it? And then why on earth would you get into it? And I think that the why is what trickles out to customers and to people that like this place. And it's always been about sort of sharing the excitement and the joy that we get out of discovering new things, right? So we try to provide a level of interest on the beer side with lots of variety that we think is obviously exciting for us and exciting for other folks. But we also try to do the same thing on the food side. So when it comes to a burger and fries, is there a way that we can make this a little more interesting than just your run-of-the-mill burger and fries? And, we've gone through a bunch of different ways to make a burger, but originally we said, well, let's just make a smash burger. And there weren't a lot of folks that were doing that at the time, 2017. There was, like Shake Shack had a reasonable smash burger, a good one. But there weren't a lot of folks doing it locally. So we said, let's give it a shot and see how it comes out. And so we did a lot of experiments and tried different things and ways of making it. And we found one way that we really liked and we thought people would like. But also, if you look at our menu from a food perspective, there's a lot of different things. There's influence from other cultures. There's influence from, other regions in the United States. There's sort of things that we do that are a little bit surprising in a brewery. And so I think that that's stuff that we are interested in and gets us excited about food and beer and culture and other things that are interesting for, even music in this place, right? We play music that's not necessarily just pop hits. It's something that's interesting. I think all those things together, when folks come here, they're pleasantly surprised at what we have available. Picky eaters might struggle a little bit, but I think people are pleasantly surprised when they show up and all the stuff that we have available.
You started this in 2014. If I would have told you 10 years ago that you would move beyond your 5-year plan, that you would be producing and distributing one of the most popular beers in the region, that you'd have this massive space, that you'd have a restaurant, that you would have a thriving business in an industry that is very tough to build thriving businesses in. If I would have told you that then, what would you have said?
I would say, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that that ever crossed our minds. I mean, the 5-year plan, I think, was solid, and we had no clue what was going to happen after that. So we kind of hoped the wind would blow our sails, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, we didn't think that we would have a restaurant. Clearly, we didn't think that it would be this popular. Again, a lot of luck and some hard work, and it happened. But we definitely look at it and are pleasantly surprised and obviously happy that the people are still showing up.
Final question. Pete, what is your mission?
I think that for me, my mission is I want to share stuff that I discover. If you think about it this way, we originally started with, we thought that word of mouth would be the best way to quote unquote market this place. So I look at it like you see a band in a small club. You see a really good act in a small club, and you feel like you're a member of that club because you're the only one that really knows about it. And you see a band that blows you away, and you're like, wow, these guys are awesome. And you secretly hope that they're going to be able to play this club all the time, and they'll this little music space or whatever. And you hope that they're never going to be at Gillette Stadium, because then you're going to be sitting in the nosebleed section, and it's going to suck. And they sold out, blah, blah, blah. Even though deep down inside, you're like proud that you knew them once upon a time, and they are selling out this arena. But when they're small and interesting to you anyway, you feel like you're part of something. And the thing you want to do is go tell everybody that you know, hey, check out this band. You know, back in the day, it was like you give somebody a burned CD of this band you saw. Nowadays, you send them a Spotify link, right? When I talk about the arena thing, or, you know, going to Gillette Stadium, that's not something that we have aspirations to be. But we hope that people come here and then tell their friends that they discovered something that was exciting to them. And, you know, when I find something that's interesting out there in the world, like a new restaurant or a dish or a flavor, an ingredient or a beer or a band still, right? If I find something like that, I want to tell my friends, and I want to say, here is this experience that I had with this XYZ thing. And I want people to have that feeling too, right? And so I think that that's normal for most people, right? When people have something that they really love, that they discover on their own, they want to share it with as many people as they can. And so that's generally been something that has excited me since we started this place, is being able to have relationships with chefs and restaurants, and relationships with people that are growing hops or growing grain. You know, I want to be like, hey, you got to try this new variety of, so I'm talking to brewers, right? You got to try this new variety of hops. It's amazing. Or you got to try this new yeast. That's awesome. And then folks that come here, did you try this beer? You got to check it out. What do you usually drink? You like hoppy? All right, try this new one. And people try it and they get excited about it. And it's like they discover something, and they have that feeling that I had when, you know, I discover something. So even the seltzer stuff, right? The seltzer stuff, the varieties that we make, it's a pretty basic beverage, but you know, sometimes we hit a flavor that's like nostalgic. Hey, do you remember back in the day you had Hawaiian Punch as a kid? Try this seltzer. It tastes like Hawaiian Punch, you know? And that's been our mission, I think, my mission from the beginning, is to really evangelize this stuff and give people that experience that I have when I discover something new.
And that's Pete Beauregard, one of 4 co-founders of Stoneface Brewing in Newington, New Hampshire. Their latest beverage, the Seacoast Seltzer, is available at several stores across the Seacoast, as well as their famous Stoneface IPA. For more information on the latest events at the venue, just visit stonefacebrewing.com, the link to which is in today's show notes. So like I said earlier, Pete grew up in Littleton, attended UNH, moved to Portsmouth, and has stayed on the Seacoast ever since. I was so excited to talk to him about the beer that I totally skipped over the part where we give the Seacoast the love it deserves. So, for today's final question, I asked Pete, what does he love most about the Seacoast, and why has he never thought about living anywhere else? And this is what he had to say.
It's just big enough to make me feel like there's stuff going on. Since I left Littleton, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened up there, right? There's a new brewery up there, or not new at all, actually. It's a Schilling Brewing that's I respect immensely, and they've helped to bring a lot of vibrancy to that community, and a lot of folks have moved north, but it's still a very small community, right? And down here, there's a lot more going on, but it's not too big where you feel like you're lost in the hustle and bustle. And then obviously the other thing that's great is that the ocean's so close and the mountains are so close and Boston's so close. You feel like you're in the center of the universe here in a lot of ways, right? So, it's easy to get to a big city to watch a, big time sporting event, but it's also really easy to, put the skis on the roof rack and go up 93 and hit Loon or Cannon or whatever. So that's probably why I've decided to put roots down here. It's a pretty magical place, I think.
That's a great sales pitch for the Seacoast, Pete. You've got me convinced. I might even look into buying a house here. Just kidding. I can't afford that. But I appreciate the input, and I appreciate all of you for being here, for listening to the show, for pressing the follow button, and for sharing the episodes. It means the absolute world to me. I'm bouncing all over the Seacoast this week, so if you happen to see me out and about, perhaps at Stoneface Brewing, or the park, or Three Bridges, please come up and say hi. I would love to hear your story. Until next week, everybody, live free or die.